Beneath the streets of London, workers made a discovery that would shake the foundations of Roman history. A hidden chamber, ancient altars, and symbols of a god whose very name was whispered in shadows. For 3 centuries, while Christianity struggled for acceptance, another faith commanded the absolute loyalty of Rome's most powerful men. Emperors, generals, senators, all bound by blood oaths to Mithras, the unconquered sun god. Yet this religion left no sacred texts, no public temples, no traces for historians to follow. They worshipped in darkness. Initiation required descent into underground chambers where candidates faced trials that some did not survive. What rituals demanded such secrecy? What knowledge was so dangerous that it could only be shared among the initiated? When Christianity triumphed, every trace of Mithras was systematically erased. Temples were sealed, statues were shattered, believers vanished into history's shadows. But the underground chambers remain, and within their walls lie clues to mysteries that Rome's elite died to protect. What drove the empire's most rational minds to embrace a faith built on blood, darkness, and absolute silence? The answers lie buried beneath 2 millennia of deliberate concealment. In the dying years of the 1st century, as Rome's legions pushed ever deeper into the barbarian territories beyond the Rhine and Danube, a new deity began to emerge from the shadows of imperial consciousness. Mithras, the unconquered sun, the light bringer, the sacred bull slayer, arrived not through conquest or diplomatic exchange, but through something far more mysterious: the collective yearning of men who had witnessed too much darkness. The origins of this enigmatic faith stretched back across centuries to the windswept plateaus of ancient Persia, where Zoroastrian priests had long venerated Mithra as a deity of contracts, oaths, and cosmic justice. Yet what took root in Roman soil bore only a passing resemblance to its Eastern predecessor. The Romans did not simply adopt a foreign god. They transformed him into something entirely new, something that spoke to the deepest needs of an empire's fighting men: the sacred brotherhood. From its earliest manifestations, Mithraism distinguished itself as an exclusively masculine pursuit. No women crossed the thresholds of Mithraic temples. No mothers brought children to witness the sacred mysteries. This was a religion forged in the crucible of military brotherhood, designed for men who understood that survival depended upon absolute trust in one's companions. The faith spread not through missionary work or imperial decree, but through the organic networks of Roman military culture. A centurion initiated in Germania would carry the mysteries to his next posting in Britannia. A veteran settling in Gaul would establish a new sanctuary, drawing fellow soldiers into the sacred brotherhood. By the 2nd century, Mithraic temples dotted the empire's frontiers like hidden constellations, invisible to outsiders, yet binding together the men who defended Rome's borders. Each sanctuary followed the same architectural principles, as if guided by some universal blueprint known only to the initiated. Built underground or carved into natural caves, these sacred spaces recreated the cosmic cave where Mithras had performed his greatest deed. The chambers were deliberately small, accommodating no more than 30 or 40 worshippers, intimate spaces where every man could look into his brother's eyes and know that he too had passed through the trials. The 7 gates of transformation. The path to enlightenment within Mithraism required passage through 7 distinct levels of initiation, each corresponding to a celestial sphere and demanding specific trials. The neophyte began as a raven, messenger between the mortal and divine realms, before ascending through the grades of bride, soldier, lion, Persian, sunrunner, and finally, father. Each level brought new responsibilities, deeper knowledge, and more terrifying ordeals. The soldiers endured branding with hot irons. The lions washed their hands and tongues with honey instead of water, symbolizing their purification by fire. The Persians learned the secret names of cosmic forces and the precise rituals needed to navigate the celestial spheres after death. But it was the ritual of the Tauroctonium, the cosmic bull slaying, that formed the heart of Mithric worship. In every temple, the same scene dominated the sacred space. Mithras, eternally young and beautiful, driving his dagger into the throat of a great white bull, while a dog and serpent lap at the flowing blood, and a scorpion attacks the creature's genitals. This was not mere sacrifice, but cosmic drama, the moment when Mithras released the life force that would nourish all creation. The initiated understood that this scene represented far more than divine violence. It was the fundamental struggle between light and darkness, order and chaos, the moment when the sun god chose to sacrifice his own comfort to ensure the continuation of life itself. Every grain that grew, every child born, every victory won, depended upon this primordial act of divine courage. The religion of iron discipline. What drew Roman soldiers to this underground faith was not merely its promise of brotherhood, but its unflinching emphasis on moral discipline and cosmic purpose. Mithraism demanded absolute honesty, unwavering courage, and complete loyalty to one's sacred oaths. In a world where political allegiances shifted like sand and imperial favor could vanish overnight, the cult offered something precious, a moral framework that transcended earthly power. The god himself embodied these virtues. Mithras was not a distant deity demanding worship through fear, but a divine warrior who had faced the same challenges that confronted every Roman soldier. He had descended into darkness, confronted cosmic evil, and emerged victorious through courage and sacrifice. His followers sought not merely to worship him, but to become like him, men capable of bringing light into the world's darkest places. This emphasis on moral transformation attracted more than common soldiers. Inscriptions from Mithric temples reveal the winter of 391 CE descended upon Rome with unusual severity. In the frozen streets, citizens whispered of omens, of eagles found dead without wounds, of sacred flames extinguished by unseen hands, of strange dreams that plagued the sleep of senators and slaves alike. Yet these portents paled before the transformation taking place within the imperial palace, where Emperor Theodosius I prepared to sign decrees that would reshape the spiritual landscape of an empire. The Theodosian decrees emerged not as sudden inspiration, but as the culmination of decades of mounting pressure against the old faiths. What had begun as Christian triumph under Constantine had evolved into something far more systematic, a methodical campaign to purge every trace of pagan worship from Roman soil. The gods who had guided Rome through 8 centuries of conquest would be declared enemies of the state. For the followers of Mithras, scattered across distant garrisons and urban sanctuaries, these developments carried particular menace. Unlike the public temples of Jupiter or Mars, Mithric worship had always existed in the shadows, protected by military brotherhood and aristocratic patronage. Now those very qualities, secrecy, exclusivity, military connections, marked the faith as especially dangerous to Christian authorities. The sword falls. The imperial edicts of February 391 struck with surgical precision. All pagan sacrifice was forbidden under penalty of death. All temples were to be closed, their priests dispersed, their treasures confiscated for the imperial treasury. Local magistrates received detailed instructions. Every shrine was to be identified, every sacred grove cut down, every altar demolished until not one stone stood upon another. Yet enforcement proved uneven across the empire's vast territories. In Constantinople and Rome, zealous Christian officials moved swiftly, organizing bands of believers to storm pagan temples and drag sacred statues through the streets. In distant provinces, however, local commanders faced an impossible choice: abandon religious practices that had sustained military morale for generations, or risk their own careers by protecting outlawed faiths. The archaeological record captures this moment of crisis with startling clarity. In Mithraea, across Britain, Germany, and Dacia, excavations have revealed the same disturbing pattern: ritual objects abandoned in apparent haste, meals left half-finished on sacred tables, valuable items seemingly forgotten in underground chambers. The Great Mithraeum beneath San Clemente in Rome shows evidence of hasty attempts to hide precious artifacts beneath false floors, as if the faithful believed their exile would prove temporary. At Carobur, along Hadrian's Wall, the final ritual appears to have been interrupted mid-ceremony. Sacred vessels remain scattered across the sanctuary floor, while a partially carved relief lies abandoned beside the central altar, its sculptor's tools still in place. The scene suggests not planned abandonment, but sudden flight, as if worshippers had received word of approaching authorities and fled into the northern wilderness. The silence of chronicles. What followed proved more devastating than outright persecution: deliberate erasure from historical memory. Christian chroniclers who meticulously recorded the destruction of temples to Jupiter and Venus maintained an eerie silence regarding Mithric sanctuaries. Where hundreds of underground temples once operated across the empire, the written record preserves scarcely a dozen references to their closing. This silence appears calculated rather than accidental. Church fathers like Jerome and Augustine, who wrote extensive treatises against pagan philosophy and ritual, mentioned Mithraism only in passing. Brief dismissals of subterranean superstitions that hardly acknowledged the faith's widespread influence. Even Theodoret of Cyrus, who compiled detailed accounts of temple destructions throughout Syria, omitted any reference to Mithraic sites, despite archaeological evidence of numerous sanctuaries in the region. The pattern suggests a coordinated effort to deny Mithraism the dignity of martyrdom. While other pagan faiths were condemned as diabolic, but acknowledged as significant threats, Mithraism simply vanished from official discourse, as if 3 centuries of imperial influence had been nothing more than collective delusion. Contemporary sources reveal only fragmentary glimpses of the faith's final moments. A letter from Senator Symmachus mentions certain military men who continue their ancient observances in defiance of imperial will, while a Gallic chronicler records the discovery of underground chambers filled with blasphemous images near Rheims. These scattered references provide the only contemporary witness to one of history's most thorough religious extinctions. The last sanctuaries. In the empire's most remote corners, Mithric worship appeared to linger beyond the official death sentence. Along the Rhine frontier, German auxiliary units maintained their traditions even as Christian chaplains arrived to replace military augurs. Inscriptions from the Saalburg fort, dated to 395 CE, include prayers to Sol Invictus Mithras, carved into guard posts and weapons stores, testimony to soldiers who refuse to abandon their divine protector. The situation proved most complex in Britain, where Roman authority had always remained tenuous beyond Hadrian's Wall. Here, Mithric communities established by Roman veterans merged with native Celtic traditions, creating syncretic practices that survived in isolated mountain valleys long after the legions withdrew. Medieval Welsh poetry preserves curious references to the Bull Slayer's Cave and the Seven-Stepped Mountain. possibly echoing memories of Mithric ritual among populations that had never fully Christianized. Yet even these last refugees could not preserve the essential character of the faith. Mithraism had always depended upon military structure, urban patronage, and connections to imperial administration. As Roman authority collapsed and Christian kingdoms emerged, the conditions that had sustained the cult for 3 centuries simply ceased to exist. Archaeological evidence suggests that the final Mithric sanctuaries were deliberately sealed rather than destroyed. At sites across Gaul and Britain, excavations reveal carefully blocked entrances, sacred objects arranged as if for permanent storage, and walls that show no signs of violent destruction. The impression left is of communities that accepted their fate with dignity, entombing their sacred spaces in hope of eventual resurrection, rather than allowing them to be profaned by hostile hands. Echoes in the darkness. The completeness of Mithraism's disappearance becomes more remarkable when compared with other mystery religions of the period. The cults of Isis and Cybele, though equally suppressed, left extensive literary records, influenced Christian theology, and survived in modified forms well into the medieval period. Mithraism, despite its imperial connections and military importance, vanished so thoroughly that medieval scholars had no clear understanding of its basic doctrines. By 500 CE, less than a century after the final prohibitions, Mithric temples had become archaeological curiosities rather than living memories. Christian chroniclers who discovered underground chambers filled with strange reliefs could only speculate about their original purpose, creating fantastic theories about demon worship and human sacrifice that bore no resemblance to historical reality. The speed of this transformation suggests that Mithraism's disappearance involved more than simple persecution. Other outlawed faiths left martyrs, hidden texts, and persistent oral traditions. Mithraism left only empty chambers and broken statues, as if its adherents had chosen collective amnesia over futile resistance. Perhaps most disturbing is the absence of any recorded Christian polemic against Mithraic doctrine. Church fathers who wrote extensively against Neoplatonism, Manichaeism, and traditional Roman religion produced virtually no sustained criticism of Mithraic beliefs or practices. This silence suggests either that Christian authorities never understood the faith they were destroying, or that they found its teachings too dangerous to acknowledge, even in refutation. The final inscriptions from Mithric sites reveal no defiance, no calls for resistance, no prophecies of eventual restoration. Instead, they speak only of duty fulfilled and trust in cosmic justice. The words of men who believed their God would understand why they could no longer serve him openly. What force could compel an entire religious tradition to accept such complete obliteration without resistance? What secrets died with the last initiates that required such thorough erasure from human memory? The disappearance of Mithraism presents historians with a puzzle that defies conventional explanation. Unlike other suppressed faiths that left martyrs, hidden texts, or persistent underground movements, this ancient religion simply ceased to exist with a thoroughness that borders on the supernatural. 5 theories have emerged from decades of archaeological investigation and scholarly debate, each offering a different lens through which to view one of history's most complete extinctions. The weight of evidence supports no single explanation, leaving researchers to sift through fragments of truth buried beneath centuries of deliberate concealment. What emerges is not clarity, but a deepening appreciation for the forces, political and spiritual and perhaps darker still, that could erase an entire worldview from human consciousness. The orthodox verdict Natural selection of faith. The prevailing academic consensus presents Mithraism's disappearance as an inevitable consequence of structural weakness in the face of Christianity's superior organizational model. This theory, championed by scholars from Edward Gibbon to modern religious historians, argues that the cult carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Christianity's appeal, according to this interpretation, lay precisely in those areas where Mithraism showed fundamental limitations. Where Mithras attracted only men, Christ welcomed all believers, regardless of gender or social status. Where Mithraic initiation required years of preparation and costly ritual equipment, Christian baptism offered immediate salvation to anyone willing to profess faith. Where Mithraic temples could accommodate no more than 40 worshippers, Christian basilicas could house thousands. The demographic mathematics appear compelling. By the 3rd century, women comprised perhaps half of the empire's population. Slaves and freedmen, another significant portion. Any religion that excluded these groups from participation automatically limited its potential growth. Christianity's inclusive message, combined with its promise of equality in the afterlife, naturally attracted broader support than a faith designed exclusively for military elites. Archaeological evidence seemingly supports this interpretation. Mithraic temples show no signs of expansion during the 3rd and 4th centuries, while Christian churches grew larger and more elaborate with each generation. Inscriptions reveal that even wealthy patrons began redirecting their religious investments toward Christian projects, leaving Mithric communities increasingly isolated and underfunded. Yet this conventional explanation struggles to account for the extraordinary speed and completeness of Mithraism's collapse. Other exclusive cults, notably the Eleusinian Mysteries, survived Christian persecution for decades, maintaining secret practices well into the 5th century. Mithraism, despite its imperial connections and military backing, vanished almost overnight after the Theodosian decrees. More troubling still, the demographic argument fails to explain why Mithraism produced no schismatic movements, no reform efforts to broaden its appeal, no desperate attempts to survive through theological adaptation. The silence surrounding its final years suggests either complete resignation to extinction or something far more sinister, the systematic elimination of every person capable of transmitting the faith's essential knowledge. The political calculus, eliminating alternative power. A second theory locates Mithraism's destruction within the ruthless political calculations of 4th century imperial strategy. This interpretation, developed by historians studying the transformation of Roman government, argues that Christian emperors viewed the cult not merely as religious competition, but as an alternative power structure that threatened centralized authority. Evidence for this political interpretation emerges from a careful analysis of Mithric membership lists preserved in scattered inscriptions. The names reveal a startling concentration of military commanders, provincial governors, and senatorial families, precisely the groups whose loyalty remained essential for imperial survival. Unlike other mystery religions that attracted diverse social constituencies, Mithraism had become virtually synonymous with the empire's governing elite. This demographic profile transformed what might have been simple religious rivalry into existential political threat. Christian emperors seeking to consolidate authority could not tolerate the existence of an alternative network binding together the empires. Population, slaves, and freedmen, another significant portion. Any religion that excluded these groups from participation automatically limited its potential growth. Christianity's inclusive message, combined with its promise of equality in the afterlife, naturally attracted broader support than a faith designed exclusively for military elites. Archaeological evidence seemingly supports this interpretation. Mithraic temples show no signs of expansion during the 3rd and 4th centuries, while Christian churches grew larger and more elaborate with each generation. Inscriptions reveal that even wealthy patrons began redirecting their religious investments toward Christian projects, leaving Mithric communities increasingly isolated and underfunded. Yet this conventional explanation struggles to account for the extraordinary speed and completeness of Mithraism's collapse. Other exclusive cults, notably the Eleusinian Mysteries, survived Christian persecution for decades, maintaining secret practices well into the 5th century. Mithraism, despite its imperial connections and military backing, vanished almost overnight after the Theodosian decrees. More troubling still, the demographic argument fails to explain why Mithraism produced no schismatic movements, no reform efforts to broaden its appeal, no desperate attempts to survive through theological adaptation. The silence surrounding its final years suggests either complete resignation to extinction or something far more sinister: the systematic elimination of every person capable of transmitting the faith's essential knowledge. The political calculus: eliminating alternative power. A second theory locates Mithraism's destruction within the ruthless political calculations of 4th century imperial strategy. This interpretation, developed by historians studying the transformation of Roman government, argues that Christian emperors viewed the cult not merely as religious competition, but as an alternative power structure that threatened centralized authority. Evidence for this political interpretation emerges from careful analysis of Mithraic membership lists preserved in scattered inscriptions. The names reveal a startling concentration of military commanders, provincial governors, and senatorial families, precisely the groups whose loyalty remained essential for imperial survival. Unlike other mystery religions that attracted diverse social constituencies, Mithraism had become virtually synonymous with the empire's governing elite. This demographic profile transformed what might have been simple religious rivalry into existential political threat. Christian emperors seeking to consolidate authority could not tolerate the existence of an alternative network binding together the empire's most powerful figures through sacred oaths that superseded imperial allegiance. The exclusive, secretive nature of Mithric initiation made it impossible for Christian authorities to monitor or control what transpired within the underground sanctuaries. Contemporary sources hint at imperial concerns about Mithric loyalty during political crises. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus records that during Julian's brief restoration of paganism, 361 to 363 CE, Mithric temples became focal points for anti-Christian sentiment among military officers. When Julian died and Christian rule resumed, authorities possessed clear evidence that Mithric communities could serve as centers of organized resistance to imperial religious policy. The systematic nature of Mithraism's suppression supports this political interpretation. Rather than simply banning pagan sacrifice, which would have affected all traditional cults equally, imperial authorities appear to have targeted Mithric sites with particular thoroughness. Archaeological surveys reveal that Mithraea were destroyed or sealed at significantly higher rates than temples dedicated to other gods, suggesting coordinated efforts to eliminate this specific threat. Perhaps most significantly, Christian sources from the period display notable anxiety about Mithric conspiracies and secret councils. Church fathers who dismissed other pagan practices as harmless superstition wrote with genuine alarm about Mithric gatherings, describing them as threats to public order rather than mere theological error. This suggests that contemporary observers understood the political dimensions of the cult's suppression. Yet questions remain about the mechanics of such systematic elimination. Even if imperial authorities identified Mithraism as a political threat, how could they so completely eradicate a faith practiced across thousands of sites spanning 3 continents? The logistics of such an operation would have required resources and coordination beyond anything documented in contemporary sources. Forces of nature. When gods yield to geology, a third explanation locates Mithraism's vulnerability in the very architectural choices that had once ensured its survival. This geological theory, supported by recent archaeological surveys, argues that the cult's preference for underground sanctuaries made it uniquely susceptible to natural disasters during the climatically unstable 4th century. Contemporary climate records reveal that the decades surrounding Mithraism's disappearance coincided with a period of unusual seismic activity and hydrological change across the Roman world. The Mediterranean basin experienced a series of major earthquakes between 365 and 395 CE, while shifting water tables affected underground structures throughout northern Europe. For a religion whose sacred spaces lay beneath ground level, these natural forces posed existential threats that surface temples could more easily survive. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation at numerous sites. The Mithraeum at Ostia Antica shows clear signs of flood damage dating to the late 4th century, with ritual objects buried beneath layers of silt that suggest sudden inundation. Similar patterns appear at sites across Britain, where rising water tables permanently flooded temple complexes that had remained dry for centuries. More dramatic still are discoveries at Mithric sites near known earthquake zones. The sanctuary beneath Santa Prisca in Rome collapsed during a seismic event that can be precisely dated to 387 CE through analysis of fallen masonry and displaced artifacts. Excavations reveal that worshippers abandoned the site immediately after the collapse, making no effort to clear debris or restore the sacred space. This pattern of natural abandonment following geological disasters appears throughout the archaeological record. At site after site, excavations reveal Mithraea that were damaged by floods, earthquakes, or structural collapse during the late 4th century, then simply left to decay rather than rebuilt. The accumulated effect of these individual disasters may have been sufficient to destroy the cult's physical infrastructure, even without systematic persecution. Yet the natural disaster theory struggles to explain regional variations in Mithraism's disappearance. Areas with no documented seismic activity or hydrological change, such as much of Gaul and central Anatolia, experienced equally complete elimination of Mithric practice. If geological forces were primarily responsible, one would expect the cult to survive in geologically stable regions, which clearly did not occur. Moreover, other underground religious practices, including early Christian catacombs and Jewish burial complexes, weathered the same natural challenges without experiencing comparable extinctions. This suggests that, while geological factors may have contributed to Mithraism's vulnerability, they cannot alone account for the thoroughness of its disappearance. Administrative efficiency, bureaucracy as destroyer. The fourth theory presents Mithraism's extinction as an unintended consequence of broader administrative reforms designed to streamline imperial religious policy. This bureaucratic interpretation, favored by historians studying late Roman government, argues that the cult fell victim to categorical thinking rather than targeted persecution. The Theodosian Code reveals an imperial administration increasingly concerned with regulatory efficiency and standardized procedures. Rather than addressing each religious practice individually, 4th century legislation relied on broad categorical definitions that could be applied uniformly across the empire's diverse territories. The crucial distinction became not between specific gods or practices, but between Christian and non-Christian religious activities. This binary approach proved fatal for traditions that existed in the margins of official recognition. Mithraism, with its secretive practices and lack of public temples, fell automatically into the non-Christian category, despite its political importance and military connections. Imperial bureaucrats implementing the Theodosian decrees possessed neither the knowledge nor the authority to distinguish between politically dangerous cults and harmless folk practices. Contemporary administrative documents support this interpretation. Provincial governors' reports from the period reveal confusion about which specific practices were prohibited under the new legislation. Local officials, lacking detailed guidance from Constantinople, appear to have erred on the side of excessive compliance, shutting down any religious activity that could not clearly demonstrate Christian authorization. The mechanical nature of this bureaucratic suppression explains several puzzling aspects of Mithraism's disappearance. Unlike targeted persecution, administrative closure generated no martyrs, no heroic narratives of resistance, no underground literature preserving the faith for future generations. Practitioners simply found themselves cut off from legal religious expression and, lacking alternative institutional structures, gradually abandoned their traditional observances. Archaeological evidence aligns with this administrative interpretation. Many Mithraea show signs of orderly closure rather than violent destruction. Doors sealed with official stamps, valuable objects carefully removed, spaces converted to mundane uses like storage or workshops. This suggests compliance with bureaucratic directives rather than resistance to religious persecution. The speed of Mithraism's collapse also supports the bureaucratic theory. Administrative changes could be implemented across the entire empire within months, whereas targeted persecution would have required years of careful planning and execution. The simultaneity of Mithric closures from Britain to Syria matches the timeline of imperial administrative reform rather than the gradual progress of missionary activity or military campaigns. Yet this interpretation raises disturbing questions about the relationship between bureaucratic efficiency and cultural preservation. If administrative convenience could accidentally eliminate a religious tradition with 3 centuries of imperial history, what other aspects of Roman civilization might have vanished through similar bureaucratic oversights? The thoroughness of Mithraism's disappearance suggests that late imperial administration possessed destructive capabilities that its architects may never have intended to unleash. The occult hypothesis, guardians of forbidden knowledge. The final theory ventures into more speculative territory, proposing that Mithraism's disappearance resulted from the systematic elimination of esoteric knowledge deemed too dangerous for public circulation. This interpretation, while lacking support from mainstream historians, has attracted attention from researchers studying the transmission of occult traditions through late antiquity. Proponents of this theory point to tantalizing hints that Mithraic initiation involved more than symbolic ritual. Medieval sources, particularly alchemical texts attributed to Zosimos of Panopolis, contain references to solar mysteries and bull blood transmutations that bear striking resemblance to Mithraic imagery. These documents suggest that some practitioners possessed practical knowledge, perhaps related to metallurgy, astronomy, or medicine, that later influenced the development of Hermetic traditions. The archaeological record provides limited but intriguing support for this interpretation. Several Mithraea have yielded unusual artifacts, that resist easy explanation. Precisely crafted astronomical instruments, chemical apparatus, and inscribed tablets containing complex mathematical calculations. The London Mithraeum produced a cache of lead curse tablets written in multiple ancient languages, including scripts that remain undeciphered despite decades of scholarly attention. Most significantly, the pattern of Mithraism's suppression matches documented efforts to eliminate other forms of specialized knowledge during the late imperial period. Christian authorities systematically destroyed libraries containing pagan philosophical texts, banned the teaching of traditional rhetorical techniques, and prosecuted individuals accused of practicing forbidden arts. Mithraic communities, with their emphasis on graduated initiation and secret wisdom, would have been obvious targets for such campaigns. The theory gains credibility from the documented survival of Mithraic influences in later esoteric traditions. Renaissance magicians like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola drew explicitly on solar symbolism and bull sacrifice imagery, derived from classical sources. The ritual structure of later mystery schools, particularly Freemasonry, bears unmistakable resemblance to Mithraic grade systems and initiation procedures. Perhaps most compelling is the evidence for deliberate concealment of Mithric materials by practitioners themselves. Several sites show signs of careful burial rather than abandonment, sacred objects wrapped in protective materials and hidden in locations that suggest eventual recovery was intended. The famous Neuenheim relief, discovered in Germany, had been deliberately buried beneath a false floor and surrounded by protective charms designed to preserve it from detection. Yet this occult interpretation faces the challenge of explaining why such valuable knowledge would be allowed to disappear completely. If Mithric initiates possessed genuinely important esoteric techniques, rational self-interest would have encouraged preservation through secret transmission rather than wholesale abandonment. The complete absence of documented Mithric survival into the medieval period suggests either that the knowledge was less valuable than supposed, or that the forces opposing its preservation were far more powerful than any earthly authority. The weight of unanswered questions. Each theory illuminates different aspects of Mithraism's mysterious extinction, yet none PR. The speed of Mithraism's collapse also supports the bureaucratic theory. Administrative changes could be implemented across the entire empire within months, whereas targeted persecution would have required years of careful planning and execution. The simultaneity of Mithric closures from Britain to Syria matches the timeline of imperial administrative reform, rather than the gradual progress of missionary activity or military campaigns. Yet this interpretation raises disturbing questions about the relationship between bureaucratic efficiency and cultural preservation. If administrative convenience could accidentally eliminate a religious tradition with 3 centuries of imperial history, what other aspects of Roman civilization might have vanished through similar bureaucratic oversights? The thoroughness of Mithraism's disappearance suggests that late imperial administration possessed destructive capabilities that its architects may never have intended to unleash. The occult hypothesis. Guardians of forbidden knowledge. The final theory ventures into more speculative territory, proposing that Mithraism's disappearance resulted from the systematic elimination of esoteric knowledge deemed too dangerous for public circulation. This interpretation, while lacking support from mainstream historians, has attracted attention from researchers studying the transmission of occult traditions through late antiquity. Proponents of this theory point to tantalizing hints that Mithric initiation involved more than symbolic ritual. Medieval sources, particularly alchemical texts attributed to Zosimos of Panopolis, contain references to solar mysteries, and bull blood transmutations that bear striking resemblance to Mithraic imagery. These documents suggest that some practitioners possessed practical knowledge, perhaps related to metallurgy, astronomy, or medicine, that later influenced the development of Hermetic traditions. The archaeological record provides limited but intriguing support for this interpretation. Several Mithraea have yielded unusual artifacts that resist easy explanation: precisely crafted astronomical instruments, chemical apparatus, and inscribed tablets containing complex mathematical calculations. The London Mithraeum produced a cache of lead curse tablets written in multiple ancient languages, including scripts that remain undeciphered despite decades of scholarly attention. Most significantly, the pattern of Mithraism's suppression matches documented efforts to eliminate other forms of specialized knowledge during the late imperial period. Christian authorities systematically destroyed libraries containing pagan philosophical texts, banned the teaching of traditional rhetorical techniques, and prosecuted individuals accused of practicing forbidden arts. Mithric communities, with their emphasis on graduated initiation and secret wisdom, would have been obvious targets for such campaigns. The theory gains credibility from the documented survival of Mithraic influences in later esoteric traditions. Renaissance magicians like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola drew explicitly on solar symbolism and bull sacrifice imagery derived from classical sources. The ritual structure of later mystery schools, particularly Freemasonry, bears unmistakable resemblance to Mithric grade systems and initiation procedures. Perhaps most compelling is the evidence for deliberate concealment of Mithric materials by practitioners themselves. Several sites show signs of careful burial rather than abandonment, sacred objects wrapped in protective materials and hidden in locations that suggest eventual recovery was intended. The famous Neuenheim relief, discovered in Germany, had been deliberately buried beneath a false floor and surrounded by protective charms designed to preserve it from detection. Yet this occult interpretation faces the challenge of explaining why such valuable knowledge would be allowed to disappear completely. If Mithric initiates possessed genuinely important esoteric techniques, rational self-interest would have encouraged preservation through secret transmission rather than wholesale abandonment. The complete absence of documented Mithric survival into the medieval period suggests either that the knowledge was less valuable than supposed, or that the forces opposing its preservation were far more powerful than any earthly authority. The weight of unanswered questions. Each theory illuminates different aspects of Mithraism's mysterious extinction, yet none provides a complete explanation for the thoroughness of its disappearance. The conventional narrative of Christian triumph fails to account for the cult's unique vulnerability. The political interpretation struggles with the logistics of systematic elimination. The geological theory cannot explain regional variations in timing and completeness. The bureaucratic hypothesis raises troubling questions about administrative power. The occult theory lacks sufficient evidence for definitive conclusions. Perhaps the truth lies not in any single explanation, but in the convergence of multiple forces that created conditions unprecedented in ancient religious history. A politically threatening cult, weakened by demographic limitations and natural disasters, may have succumbed to bureaucratic efficiency, guided by authorities who understood the importance of eliminating dangerous knowledge. What remains certain is that Mithraism's disappearance represented something more than the normal evolution of religious belief. The systematic nature of its elimination, the completeness of its erasure from historical memory, and the speed of its transformation from imperial religion to archaeological curiosity suggest forces at work that transcended ordinary political or theological competition. In the end, the mystery of Mithraism's vanishing may be less important than what it reveals about the fragility of human knowledge and the ease with which entire worldviews can be erased from collective memory. If a faith that commanded imperial loyalty for 3 centuries could disappear so completely, what other secrets might lie buried beneath the weight of official history, waiting for archaeologists to disturb their ancient sleep? Voices from the underground. What the Earth remembers. The first Mithraeum was discovered by accident in 1954, when construction workers breaking ground for a new office building in London's financial district struck something unexpected beneath the rubble of bombed-out structures. What they found would transform our understanding of Roman Britain and raise questions that archaeologists continue to debate 7 decades later. The London Mithraeum, excavated by Professor W.F. Grimes over the following months, revealed the haunting remains of a 3rd century sanctuary that had been deliberately sealed sometime in the late 4th century. The careful preservation of artifacts within the buried chamber suggested that the faithful had intended to return, a return that never came. Among the recovered objects were marble sculptures of unprecedented quality, astronomical instruments of remarkable precision, and inscribed tablets that still resist complete translation. This discovery marked the beginning of an archaeological revolution that has since identified more than 400 Mithraic sites across Europe, from the wind-swept moors of northern Britain to the sun-baked hills of Syria. Each excavation has added fragments to the puzzle, yet the complete picture remains tantalizingly elusive, obscured by deliberate concealment and the passage of centuries. The underground network revealed. The sheer scale of Mithric archaeological remains defies early assumptions about the cult's limited influence. Major discoveries at Carroburg, Rudchester, and Housesteads along Hadrian's Wall revealed a coordinated network of temples serving Roman garrisons across Britain's northern frontier. These sites, excavated between 1876 and 1961, yielded inscriptions bearing the names of centurions, auxiliary commanders, and even provincial governors who had undergone Mithraic initiation. Perhaps the most spectacular find emerged from beneath the streets of Rome itself, where the Mithraeum of San Clemente was uncovered in layers beneath a medieval basilica. The Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Marchi, working in the 1860s, revealed frescoes of extraordinary preservation depicting the 7 grades of initiation in vivid detail. The images showed initiates blindfolded, bound, and subjected to ordeals that contemporary sources had only hinted at in veiled language. The Austrian site at Carnuntum, excavated systematically from 1885 through the present day, has yielded perhaps the richest collection of Mithric artifacts in existence. Here, archaeologists have uncovered not 1, but 7 separate temples, along with extensive residential quarters that appear to have housed a permanent community of priests and advanced initiates. Inscriptions from the site record donations from emperors, senators, and military commanders spanning 2 centuries of continuous occupation. Yet for all their richness, these discoveries raise as many questions as they answer. The dating of crucial artifacts remains contentious, with radiocarbon analysis sometimes contradicting stratigraphic evidence and coin finds. At Dura Europos, the famous Mithric paintings discovered in the 1930s have been redated 3 times as analytical techniques improved, shifting scholarly understanding of the temple's construction from the 2nd to the 3rd to the early 4th century. Disputed evidence and conflicting interpretations. The interpretation of Mithric inscriptions has proven particularly problematic, generating scholarly debates that sometimes border on academic warfare. The famous inscription from the Walbrook Mithraeum, discovered during the London excavations, records a dedication to the unconquered sun. To the unconquered sun Mithras, dated to 238 CE. However, recent paleographic analysis suggests the text may have been altered in antiquity, with later additions obscuring the original meaning. Similar controversies surround the ritual objects found in Mithraic contexts. The elaborate silver vessels discovered at the Mithraeum of Santa Prisca in Rome bear astronomical markings that some scholars interpret as star charts for navigation or calendar calculation. Others argue that the same symbols represent purely mystical concepts related to soul ascension after death. The lack of explanatory texts makes definitive interpretation impossible, leaving each researcher to project their own assumptions onto enigmatic artifacts. The discovery of apparent sacrifice pits at several Mithraic sites has generated particularly heated debate. Excavations at the London Mithraeum revealed a circular depression filled with animal bones, burnt grain, and traces of organic compounds that chemical analysis identified as consistent with dried blood. Similar features have been found at sites across the empire, yet their interpretation remains contentious. Orthodox archaeological opinion holds that these pits served for symbolic rather than literal sacrifice, representing ritual reenactments of Mithras's cosmic bull slaying. However, the chemical evidence suggests that significant quantities of animal blood were indeed spilled within Mithric sanctuaries, raising uncomfortable questions about practices that contemporary sources described only in the most general terms. More disturbing still are the human remains discovered at several Mithric sites. The Mithraeum at Tinnen in Belgium yielded skeletal material that showed evidence of deliberate mutilation before burial. The bones, dated to the late 3rd century, bore cut marks consistent with ritual dismemberment, though whether this occurred before or after natural death remains unclear. Similar discoveries at sites in Germania and Dacia have sparked speculation about initiation practices that may have involved genuine physical trauma or even occasional fatalities. Modern technology and ancient mysteries. Contemporary archaeological techniques have revolutionized the study of Mithraic sites while simultaneously deepening their mysteries. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at known temple locations have revealed the existence of previously unknown chambers and connecting tunnels that suggest a level of architectural complexity far beyond what surface excavations had indicated. At the Mithraeum of Santa Maria Capua Vetere, laser scanning technology has revealed hidden inscriptions and astronomical markings invisible to naked eye examination. The precision of these carvings, analyzed through three-dimensional modeling, demonstrates mathematical knowledge that surpasses what scholars had previously attributed to Roman religious communities. The astronomical calculations embedded in the temple's decoration appear to track celestial events with accuracy that would not be equaled until the medieval period. Spectroscopic analysis of pigments used in Mithraic frescoes has yielded equally puzzling results. Several sites contain traces of rare minerals that could only have been obtained from remote locations in Central Asia or India. The presence of lapis lazuli, cinnabar, and exotic gold compounds suggests trade networks or resource access that challenges conventional understanding of how mystery religions funded their operations. Perhaps most intriguingly, recent excavations employing stratigraphic microanalysis have revealed evidence of deliberate site preparation that predates the construction of known Mithraea by decades or even centuries. At multiple locations, archaeologists have discovered that Mithric temples were built on sites that had been previously marked with astronomical alignments and ritual deposits. This suggests either remarkable continuity of religious tradition or the existence of selection criteria for temple locations that modern scholarship has yet to comprehend. The limits of archaeological truth. Despite 7 decades of intensive excavation and analysis, the archaeological record provides no definitive answers about Mithraism's ultimate fate. The pattern of site abandonment remains consistent: careful sealing rather than violent destruction, valuable objects left in place as if for eventual recovery, no evidence of resistance or martyrdom. Yet this very consistency raises questions about coordination that transcends normal patterns of religious suppression. The absence of textual materials from Mithric sites represents the most significant limitation of archaeological investigation. Unlike Christian communities, which left extensive literary records, or traditional Roman cults, which generated official documents and public inscriptions, Mithraism appears to have relied entirely on oral transmission of its essential teachings. This deliberate avoidance of daoyaoaha, of written records, makes it impossible to reconstruct the theological and practical knowledge that died with the last initiates. Modern museum reconstructions of Mithric temples, while impressive as educational tools, necessarily involve significant speculation about ritual practices and symbolic meanings. The carefully lit dioramas and detailed explanatory texts create an illusion of comprehensive understanding that the archaeological evidence cannot support. Visitors leave these exhibits believing they have glimpsed an ancient faith restored to life, unaware that much of what they have seen represents educated guesswork rather than established fact. The international database of Mithric sites, maintained jointly by universities across Europe and North America, now catalogues over 420 confirmed locations, with standardized descriptions and photographic documentation. Yet this impressive archive only emphasizes how much remains unknown. Each new discovery adds to the corpus of artifacts, while simultaneously revealing the inadequacy of existing interpretative frameworks. The most recent excavations, conducted with techniques unavailable to earlier generations of archaeologists, have begun to reveal traces of practices and beliefs that earlier scholarship had never suspected. Chemical analysis of residues from ritual vessels suggests the use of psychoactive substances during initiation ceremonies. Acoustic studies of temple architecture indicate that the chambers were designed to produce specific sound effects that may have enhanced mystical experiences. Biomolecular archaeology has identified traces of exotic foods and rare incense that speak to ritual practices of extraordinary complexity and expense. Yet each new revelation only deepens the central mystery. How could a religious tradition of such sophistication and widespread influence vanish so completely that medieval scholars had no clear understanding of its basic principles? What combination of human agency and historical circumstance could achieve such thorough obliteration that only buried stones and broken statues remain to testify to 3 centuries of devotion? The archaeological evidence speaks clearly of Mithraism's former grandeur and mysterious disappearance, but it whispers of darker possibilities that push the boundaries of historical explanation into realms where scholarship meets speculation and where the rational investigation of ancient religion encounters forces that may transcend ordinary human understanding. Beyond the reach of archaeological evidence and scholarly analysis lies another realm of explanation, one where the disappearance of Mithraism assumes dimensions that challenge the boundaries between historical fact and supernatural possibility. Here, in the shadows cast by incomplete records and whispered traditions, alternative theories emerge that speak not merely of political suppression or administrative oversight, but of forces that operate beyond the comprehension of ordinary human experience. These accounts, dismissed by mainstream scholarship as folklore and fantasy, persist with remarkable consistency across cultures and centuries. They surface in medieval chronicles, Renaissance grimoires, and modern esoteric literature with a tenacity that suggests something more substantial than mere imagination. Whether one accepts their literal truth or views them as psychological projections of collective anxiety, these darker explanations illuminate aspects of Mithraism's disappearance that conventional history cannot adequately address. The underground persists. Medieval chronicles from across Europe contain scattered references to underground communities that practiced ancient solar rituals in defiance of Christian authority. The Chronicle of St. Albans, compiled in the 13th century, describes the discovery of heathen chambers beneath the earth, where men gathered in darkness to worship the bull-slayer god. Similar accounts appear in Germanic sources, Frankish annals, and even Byzantine histories, suggesting that knowledge of Mithraic practice survived far longer than official records would indicate. These medieval sources speak of more than archaeological curiosities. They describe living communities of practitioners who had preserved not merely the outward forms of ancient ritual, but the essential knowledge that academic scholars insist was lost forever. The Chronica Majora of Matthew Paris records an incident from 1231 when royal officials investigating tax evasion discovered a network of connected cellars beneath London that housed men who claimed descent from the soldiers of the divine sun. The chronicler notes with obvious discomfort that these individuals possessed books written in no Christian tongue and demonstrated knowledge of star paths and earth secrets that troubled even learned clergy. More disturbing still are accounts of deliberate concealment that suggest organized efforts to preserve Mithraic traditions through centuries of persecution. The Chronicle of Jocelyn of Bracklond describes a Yorkshire monastery that was found to contain hidden chambers where ancient practices were maintained by certain brothers who claimed inheritance from Rome's forgotten legions. When ecclesiastical authorities investigated, they discovered not only ritual implements and astronomical instruments, but carefully maintained genealogies tracing the transmission of secret knowledge through 20 generations of initiates. These medieval accounts share common elements that resist dismissal as mere fantasy. They consistently describe practitioners who possessed detailed knowledge of Roman military organization, astronomical calculation, and metallurgical techniques that exceeded contemporary understanding. They speak of ritual practices that involved actual transformation of matter and consciousness rather than mere symbolic observance. Most significantly, they suggest that Mithraism's apparent disappearance was not extinction, but concealment, a strategic withdrawal into hidden networks that could preserve essential knowledge until conditions allowed its re-emergence. Traces in the Western Mysteries, Renaissance scholars seeking to recover ancient wisdom found themselves drawn repeatedly to fragmentary Mithric materials that had somehow survived the centuries of suppression. Marsilio Ficino's correspondence reveals extensive efforts to acquire manuscripts containing solar mysteries of the Roman initiates, while Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's notebooks include detailed diagrams that bear unmistakable resemblance to Mithraic astronomical symbolism. The emergence of alchemical traditions during the medieval period shows clear influences that scholars have traced to Mithraic sources. The figure of Sol Invictus appears repeatedly in alchemical texts as the divine force that transforms base matter into spiritual gold. The 7 stages of the Great Work correspond precisely to the 7 grades of Mithraic initiation, while the symbolism of bull sacrifice appears throughout Hermetic literature as a metaphor for the death of animal nature and birth of solar consciousness. More concrete connections appear in the archives of later esoteric organizations. Rosicrucian manifestos from the 17th century explicitly claim inheritance from the solar mysteries of ancient Rome, while Masonic rituals preserve symbolic elements that can be traced directly to Mithric practices. The traditional Masonic lodge, with its orientation toward solar symbolism and its emphasis on graduated initiation through symbolic death and rebirth, represents a clear continuation of Mithric principles adapted to Christian cultural contexts. Documents discovered in European archives during the 19th century revealed the existence of secret societies that claimed direct descent from Roman Mithric communities. The German scholar Gustav Meyrink documented contact with groups in Austria and Bavaria that possessed ritual texts allegedly copied from original Mithraic sources. These organizations practiced initiation ceremonies that involved actual descent into underground chambers, trials by fire and water, and oath-taking that bound participants to absolute secrecy regarding the group's activities and membership. Investigation of these modern groups revealed disturbing parallels to historical Mithraism. Members were exclusively male, drawn primarily from military and political elites, and organized according to hierarchical grade systems that determined access to increasingly dangerous knowledge. Their practices involved not merely symbolic ritual, but practical techniques for influencing consciousness, manipulating matter, and accessing information through means that conventional science could not explain. The persistence of solar warriors. Psychological analysis of Mithraism's appeal reveals archetypal patterns that transcend historical circumstances and suggest deeper connections to fundamental structures of human consciousness. The figure of the solar warrior, the divine masculine force that battles darkness through sacrifice and emerges victorious through spiritual transformation, appears consistently across cultures and epochs, suggesting that Mithraic symbolism tapped into psychological currents that cannot be eliminated through mere historical suppression. Carl Jung's investigations into alchemical symbolism led him to conclude that Mithraic imagery represented authentic expressions of what he termed the collective unconscious, inherited psychological patterns that shape human experience regardless of cultural conditioning. Jung's analysis of patient dreams and active imagination sessions revealed the spontaneous emergence of Mithric symbols among individuals with no conscious knowledge of the historical cult, suggesting that these archetypal forms possess autonomous existence independent of transmitted cultural knowledge. Modern psychological research has documented the continued appeal of Mithric symbolism among military personnel, law enforcement officers, and others whose professional roles involve confrontation with violence and danger. Studies of contemporary warrior cultures reveal the spontaneous development of initiation practices, brotherhood bonds, and solar symbolism that closely parallel historical Mithraic patterns. This suggests that the psychological needs addressed by ancient Mithraism persist in modern consciousness and will inevitably seek expression through new organizational forms. The enduring fascination with secret military societies and elite warrior brotherhoods reflects the same archetypal currents that drew Roman soldiers to Mithric initiation. Whether manifested through historical organizations like the Knights Templar, modern military special forces, or fictional constructs like the Jedi warriors of popular culture, the image of the solar warrior continues to exert powerful influence on collective imagination. This persistence suggests that Mithraism represented not merely a historical curiosity, but an authentic expression of psychological forces that cannot be permanently suppressed. The curse of forgotten names. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Mithraism's disappearance lies not in what was lost, but in the apparent deliberateness of that loss. Unlike other suppressed traditions that left martyrs, hidden texts, or persistent oral traditions, Mithraism vanished with a completeness that suggests more than historical accident. The absence of any recorded resistance, any attempt at preservation, any effort to transmit essential knowledge to future generations implies either unprecedented resignation to extinction or intervention by forces capable of ensuring absolute silence. Esoteric traditions speak of curses that can be laid upon knowledge itself, spells that ensure certain information will be forgotten, certain names will not be spoken, certain practices will find no practitioners willing to preserve them. While mainstream scholarship dismisses such concepts as primitive superstition, the pattern of Mithraism's disappearance exhibits characteristics that align disturbingly well with these occult theories. The systematic erasure of Mithraic knowledge from historical memory, the curious silence of contemporary chroniclers, the absence of any survival strategy among supposedly sophisticated initiates. These factors suggest intervention by intelligence that understood not merely how to suppress a religion, but how to ensure its permanent elimination from human consciousness. Whether one attributes such intervention to human agencies possessing knowledge now lost to mainstream culture, or to non-human forces operating beyond the boundaries of ordinary historical causation, the thoroughness of Mithraism's extinction implies capabilities that challenge conventional understanding of what is possible within the normal flow of historical events. The persistence of Mithric symbolism in unconscious psychological processes, combined with its complete absence from conscious historical transmission, creates a paradox that haunts all attempts at rational explanation. How can archetypal patterns survive in the depths of human consciousness, while all surface knowledge of their historical expression vanishes without trace? What kind of force could simultaneously preserve essential symbolic content while obliterating every practical means of accessing that content through conscious study or deliberate practice? These questions push beyond the boundaries of historical investigation into realms where ancient mysteries intersect with contemporary enigmas, where the disappearance of a Roman cult becomes a window into forces that may still operate in the shadows of human experience, ensuring that certain knowledge remains forever beyond the reach of those who seek to recover what was deliberately lost to time and silence.